Hello and welcome to Getting a Handle on Concepts and Jargon in the New RDA. This session is designed for cataloging instructors, trainers, and supervisors who are new to RDA since the launch of the new RDA Toolkit in December 2020. We will cover foundational concepts and terminology found in the new toolkit, including some abstract concepts which will help you to navigate and interact with RDA. My name is Elisa Sze. I volunteer on the RDA Steering Committee as its Education and Orientation Officer. In my day job, I am a metadata librarian at the University of Toronto Libraries. I am also a sessional instructor at the Faculty of Information, University of Toronto, where I co-teach a course on cataloging for their Master of Information program. I will be the lead presenter for this session. The content of this session was developed with help from Thomas Brenndorfer. Thomas chairs the Canadian Committee on Cataloging. From 2018 to 2021, he was the NARDAC representative to the RDA Steering Committee. He is also the author of the book RDA Essentials and the Technical Services Librarian at the Guelph Public Library. Thomas is leading an advanced session at this conference called Aggregates and Diachronic Works in RDA. I encourage you to look for it in the conference program. The learning objectives for this session are to help you define basic RDA terminology in plain language, to help you explain how to navigate between different sections of RDA toolkits, and to help you enhance your ability to list and discuss some foundational RDA concepts. Throughout this session, you will see blue tab markers appear in the bottom left corner of various slides, like the one shown here. These tab markers refer to specific pages or sections of the toolkit so that you can look them up later. Let's dive right in. The official definition of RDA is that it is a package of data elements, guidelines, and instructions for creating library and cultural heritage resource metadata that are well formed according to international models for user-focused linked data applications. The 6 key themes are embedded within this definition. RDA is presented as a package of data elements, guidelines, and instructions. Think of RDA as a set of building blocks and instructions that can be used for metadata creation. RDA is primarily for creating metadata that describe library and cultural resources. RDA is about the creation of well-formed data. The standard conforms to international models, including the IFLA Library Reference Model, or LRM. The standard is user-focused. Decisions made are intended to help users of library and cultural heritage resources accomplish one of these 5 user tasks: find, identify, search, obtain, and explore. RDA compliance metadata can be reused in linked data applications by other metadata communities. The package of RDA entities, elements, vocabularies, and instructions are accessible within the subscription tool called RDA Toolkits. Let me show you what that looks like. So here is the RDA Toolkit. I have already logged in as myself. Here are the different menus that you can select from, and there is a search box located in the top right. The entities, elements, and vocabularies of RDA are also openly available through the RDA registry under a Creative Commons license. Let me show you what the RDA registry looks like. Here it is. Because RDA is built on the IFLA Library Reference Model, which itself is an entity relationship model, you will notice that there are things called entities. Entities are described using elements. There is a lot of choice around which elements can be captured to describe an entity. Because RDA is designed for adoption by a variety of data communities, there are multiple ways to implement RDA or to produce and maintain data that are RDA compliant. Let's loop back to what we mean by entity relationship model. In the entity relationship model, we record data elements to describe things and relationships between things. An entity is described as an abstract class of objects. Think of entities as the things you describe in the course of cataloging, or more precisely, as different ways to think about a resource that is based on how users use metadata in order to find, identify, search, obtain, or explore resources. Entities are something that we already think about even if we do not call them entities. Consider this scenario. A library user goes up to the reference desk and asks for Blade Runner. To identify the correct resource for the user, the reference librarian would have to ask some clarifying questions. Is the user looking for a motion picture or the novel upon which the original motion picture was based? Is the user looking for the original Ridley Scott directed motion picture or the sequel Blade Runner 2049, directed by Denis Villeneuve? These questions deal with the work entity. Perhaps the user is looking for the Ridley Scott Blade Runner, but they are looking for a specific version, not the theatrical release from 1982 or the director's cut, but rather the final cut from 2007. These are questions dealing with versions of a work, so they are in the realm of the expression entity. How about the format? Is the user looking for the motion picture captured on DVD, or do they want it through an online streaming service? These are questions dealing with a manifestation entity. RDA requires us to think in terms of entities in order to enable more precise responses to user requests. To describe entities, we describe their characteristics. We also describe entities based on the relationships they bear with other entities. We will look at a few of these different RDA entities. RDA covers 13 entities listed here. Oftentimes, to describe an information resource fully, we cannot think of a resource as exclusively one entity or another. Instead, we have to consider elements of more than one entity in order to round out our description of the resource. Again, this is because you want to create a description that contains enough information to meet a variety of anticipated user tasks. The four entities that we will explore in more detail in today's session are the entities that we often use to describe resources. They are work, expression, manifestation, and item. We will also look briefly at an example of person and nomen. Let me show you where the entities menu is located within the RDA Toolkit. So going back to the RDA Toolkit, if you look at the leftmost menu, that is called the Entities menu. And underneath are dedicated pages talking about each of the RDA entities. The work entity refers to a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. It is a conceptual object rather than a physical one. So think of work as a constellation of ideas. One of the most common elements of work that you would typically consider when describing a resource is author of a work. Like in the Blade Runner example that I posed earlier, the Ridley Scott directed motion picture Blade Runner would be considered a work. The Denis Villeneuve directed motion picture Blade Runner 2049 would be considered a separate, though related work. The expression entity refers to an intellectual or artistic realization of a work. Expressions realize a work through the use of notations such as alphabets or numbers, as well as sound, image, object, movement, or a combination of these. An expression communicates a work in a way that can be sensed by human beings. One of the most common elements of expression that you encounter when cataloging is the language of a resource. So, a literary work that has been translated into multiple languages can be said to be a work with multiple expressions. Similarly, drawing back to our Blade Runner example, multiple versions or cuts of Ridley Scott's motion picture are equivalent to multiple expressions of the same work. The manifestation entity refers to the embodiment of the expression. Think of embodiment as something that makes the communication real. Manifestations place an emphasis on the production plan, meaning the publication or manufacture of the resource that turns an expression into something that is part of the real world. In the context of print books, a manifestation can refer to all the copies of a specific print run that exists in the world. Common characteristics associated with manifestation are the ISBN of a book, the physical dimensions of a book, or the name of the publisher. An item is a single exemplar or instance of a manifestation. It could be a particular publication that you saved as a file on your computer, or a physical copy or object that you can hold in your hand, pop into a player, or place a barcode label on. If you catalog special collections at your library, a data element of item that you might need to record is source of acquisition or past ownership of a particular copy of a book. So work, expression, manifestation, and item are examples of entities. Elements are how you describe an entity and where you make data recording decisions. Each entity has its own set of elements. An element that describes one entity cannot also be used as an element to describe another entity, even if the values of each element look identical. The work and expression entities are described by elements that pertain to content. Manifestation and item entities are described by elements that pertain to the carrier. Let me quickly show you how to look up elements associated with an entity in RDA Toolkit. For this demonstration, I will show you the manifestation entity as an example. So here we are under the Entities menu. I'm going to select the page for manifestation. Normally, to understand more about an entity, you would read the definition and scope, pre-recording information, minimum description, effective description instructions, and a little bit about the entity boundaries for manifestation. Then we go through recording related instructions, and finally arrive at the last section called elements. In this submenu, we see elements that are associated with a manifestation entity. They can be organized according to attribute elements, which describe the characteristics of the manifestation entity, or they can be relationship elements, which describe a characteristic about the manifestation by referring to a relationship with another RDA entity. You may already instinctively understand the concept of attribute elements versus relationship elements, even if you have not called them as such. For example, take a look at the 4 statements that appear on your screen. Which of these statements indicate an attribute of the print book, and which statement indicates a relationship between the print book and another RDA entity? Sentence 1 says, this print book has a height of 23 centimeters. This is an attribute because it simply describes a characteristic of the print book without referring to another RDA entity. Sentence 2, the print book is 800 pages long. This is also an attribute for the same reason explained above. Sentence 3, this print book was published by Oxford University Press. This is a relationship because it points to a relationship between the print book and the publisher or agent that published the book. Sentence 4, this print book contains an English translation of Alexandre Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. This is also a relationship. It indicates a relationship between the print book and a translation of the literary work that is contained within the print book. This leads us to talk about domain and range. In RDA, domain and range always refer to RDA entities. The domain entity is always the entity that is being described by an element. An attribute element is limited to describing a domain. On the other hand, relationship elements explain how the entity described relates to another entity. The other entity in this context would be the range. In other words, when you look up an attribute element in RDA Toolkit, you will see that it only mentions a domain in its reference element card. When you look up a relationship element in RDA Toolkit, you will see its reference element card mentions both domain and range. To revisit the sample statements from the previous slide, sentence 1, this print book has a height of 23 centimeters, we can say that the domain is the manifestation because the statement describes the physical carrier. Sentence 2, the print book is 800 pages long. Again, the domain is manifestation. Sentence 3, this print book was published by Oxford University Press. Here we have a relationship between the book and its publisher. The domain is therefore manifestation and the range is agent. Sentence 4, this print book contains an English translation of Alexandre Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. Here we have a relationship between the print book and Dumas' literary work as translated into English. Because language translations of works are considered expressions, therefore, the domain of this relationship is manifestation and the range is expression. With all this talk of entities and elements, what are we actually creating with RDA? We are creating a metadata work. This can be a single metadata statement or a single piece of metadata describing an entity, or it can be a plan to bring together metadata statements describing one or more entities. This would be called a metadata description set. Bibliographic records and authority records are all examples of metadata description sets. The concept of data provenance figures into our process. Data provenance simply means that we create a description at the appropriate level of granularity needed. You may know data provenance better in terms of the source of information used for a description. The Recording a Source of Metadata section of the Data Provenance Guidance page covers the types of sources that can be used for gathering information for an element, such as the element title proper of a manifestation. Let me quickly show you what that page looks like in the toolkit. So in RDA Toolkit under the Guidance menu, we have a page dedicated to data provenance. And you would normally read through all of the instructions written here. You'll notice there is a submenu of links. If we look for recording a source of metadata, and you scroll down further, you will see instructions pertaining to how we obtain information around a manifestation that is being described. In some of my examples, you will notice that I refer to people by names and works by titles. Anytime that you want to call an entity by some label, RDA refers to that usage as a nomen. You will often see nomen referenced as an appellation. Think of appellation as a name, a title, identifier, or access point that you might use to reference another entity. When you think about relationship elements, the appellation is always what you record in the range of the relationship. Nomen itself is an entity because by being an entity, it allows us to record attributes about it. Nomen string is the element that describes nomen. The value of a nomen string is the bit of information that we as human beings can see, read, quote, type, or recite back. Let's look at an example of how we use nomens. Let's say we are trying to describe this person, an instance of an RDA entity. We will recognize this person as L.M. Montgomery, the author of Anne of Green Gables. Montgomery has been known by many names. In RDA, we refer to each of these names as nomens. Each of these nomens have a distinct nomen string whose value we may already be familiar with. Nomen 1 has the nomen string value Montgomery LM 1874 to 1942. This corresponds to the access point from the Library of Congress Name Authority file. Nomen 2 has the nomen string value MacDonald Lucy Maud Montgomery 1874 to 1942. This nomen string corresponds to her married name if recorded in the form of an access point. Nomen 3 has the nomen string value N81018346. This corresponds to the Library of Congress control number for her. Nomen 4 has the nomen string value Lucy Maud Montgomery. This corresponds to her full name in natural English order. Nomen 5 has the nomen string value Q273034. This corresponds to the identifier for her, as found in Wikidata, and so forth with other names and identifiers that refer to this person. RDA specifically tells us that a nomen is distinguished by both its associated RDA entity and its nomen string. A variation in either indicates a new nomen. This is why we can say that there are 5 different nomens on display on the slide, even though they all point to the same person. Why do we talk about nomens at all? Why can't we just focus on the nomen string? In the entity relationship model, you cannot assign properties or attributes to nomen strings, whereas you can assign properties and attributes to entities. Because nomen is an entity, we can assign properties to it, such as the script or language used to create the data about the nomen. This is what catalogers have been doing all along, for instance, in the creation of authority data. It's just that now RDA gives us the ability to take our implementation of data into a new implementation of data. It also enables non-catalogers, like system designers, to make use of our data. Each entity has its own minimum description. A minimum description simply captures the least amount of data that still represents an instance of an entity and its primary relationship to another entity. However, most libraries may prefer to provide a fuller description. These would be called an effective description and would include additional data that is accurate, reflects common usage, is able to be internationalized, is responsive to user needs, and is sufficient. How do we know what to capture in an effective description? Well, RDA is intended to be used with an application profile. The application profile specifies the elements that will be used for resource description. It also includes instructions around elements that can be repeated, elements that can be used to relate to entities, and which recording method to apply. The application profile will specify which policy statements to follow, as well as controlled vocabularies or vocabulary encoding schemes like the list of carrier types that is found within RDA toolkits. Or the application profile can also tell us how to construct our access points or the string encoding schemes that should be followed. You may already be familiar with the concept of application profiles, even if you have never called them as such. The PCC RDA BibCo standard record for RDA metadata application profile is an example of an application profile. Your library may also have policies in place around fullness of records and use of local fields in a record. These types of considerations could also go into a local application profile. Here is a view of an application profile that I have created for the purposes of this session. you will see that it contains a list of all the different elements that I would hope to describe in the course of describing a resource, as well as instructions around how that element is to be recorded. When we record the value of an element, keep in mind that some elements have a prescribed recording method, while others offer a choice. The application profile or policy statements that we follow may also prescribe one method over another. RDA accommodates four recording methods. They are unstructured description, which means transcription of text or using our own words. The second method is structured description, which refers to the recording of terms from a controlled vocabulary or authority file, or following a particular pattern, such as the construction of access points. The third recording method is identifier. This means recording the string of characters that uniquely identify an entity within a particular system. ISBN would be an example of an identifier. The fourth recording method is recording IRI, or the URL that has been assigned to represent a particular entity. For unstructured description, RDA includes guidelines on transcription. Cataloging agencies have a choice between basic or normalized transcription. Basic transcription just means that you record the data exactly as it appears on the manifestation, regardless of how the data is capitalized, punctuated, or how numerals, abbreviations, and diacritics appear. This option enables automated machine-generated description. Normalized transcription means that the cataloger follows guidelines around language and script, diacritics, capitalization, punctuation, acronyms, letters, symbols, and numbers. This is likely the method with which long-established catalogers are most familiar. Unlike with AACR2 and original RDA, abbreviations are no longer prescribed as part of the official standard because abbreviations are community dependent. The transcription method that a cataloging agency uses should be identified in the application profile because it is typically not a decision that a cataloger would make independently. I had mentioned early on that there are multiple ways of implementing RDA. Here are the four ways. Scenario A is linked open data. Scenario B is relational or object-oriented data. For example, databases consisting of relational tables. Scenario C is bibliographic or authority data, and Scenario D is flat file data. Scenario C would include records created for a MARC 21 environment and reflects what you may be most familiar with. In this scenario, we describe a single resource by creating a single record that integrates elements of work, expression, manifestation, and item. Other associated entities are recorded separately. A record describing a resource is linked to a record describing a related entity using an access point for that related entity. For this last segment of the session, we will follow a quick demonstration of an RDA-compliant metadata description set. The example we will use is a print monograph, a novel entitled Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez. To start off, think about the recording source as described in the RDA Toolkit under the guidance page Data Provenance. Remember that recording instructions will be contained within individual element pages. Just to get a few things out of the way, remember this resource is published in a single physical form, so we can say that the mode of issuance is single unit. And because the work contained in the book is a one-time work, we can say that the extension plan is static plan. We will be following the RDA implementation scenario C. Here is the front cover. We can see the title of the book and the name of the author. but we are not necessarily going to record the data exactly as it appears on the cover, because in the data provenance guidance page, we're told to prefer the title page over the cover as our source of information. So you can see that instruction from here. So we're going to go back to our resource and take a look at the title page. Here's the title page spread across 2 pages. Note the title proper, the statement of responsibility, and the publication statement. Here is the verso of the title page. You can make a mental note of the copyright statement, perhaps additional details about the publisher, as well as general notes, such as this note is a work of fiction. There is also a cataloging and publication record at the bottom. Then we flip to the last numbered page of the book, and we can see from the right side that the last numbered page is 258. We also have a bit of information about the author and a portrait of the author. On the back cover, we can see the ISBN of the book, a summary of the book, and if we were to take a ruler to measure the height of the book, we can see that the height is 21 centimeters. Before you record any data, you need to know what you are going to catalog. We can say that this resource is a piece of Canadian literature, so we will be looking to describe an element of work. This resource is communicated through written text in the English language, so we will be looking to describe an element of expression. And finally, this is a published print book that contains a textual work written in English. So because this is a print book, we will be describing the resource as a manifestation, but include relevant aspects of work, expression, and agent in order to meet a variety of potential user search and discovery needs. RDA tells us that the minimum description requirements for a manifestation should include at least an appellation of manifestation, which could be title of manifestation, access point for manifestation, or the identifier for the manifestation. It also tells us that we need to include at least one of the following: an expression manifested or work manifested elements. To enable a breadth of user tasks to be performed, we have developed an application profile that goes beyond the minimum required. The application profile tells us to apply normalized transcription rules, describe the resource using elements associated with a mix of entities. Our application profile tells us to follow control vocabulary provided within RDA, and to consult LC/PCC policy statements for additional guidance. And we're going to be following RDA implementation scenario C. So again, this is what our application profile is going to look like. So columns A to F tells us which elements we want to record values for, as well as instructions around how that element is going to be recorded. Column G contains the value that we record for those elements that have been selected. In our application profile, we will see a mix of elements pertaining to manifestation, as well as work elements and expression elements. With respect to our specific resource, certain elements will not apply because we do not have data about them. Those elements that we will omit are addition statements, color content, title of series, and numbering within sequence. So switching over to our application profile, at this point, columns A to F are the ones that are already given to us in our application profile. In order to have recorded the values that you see in column G, I looked up each of these elements, for the instructions provided by RDA, and then I filled in the data according to what I saw on the resource. So for example, the extension plan element in RDA Toolkit, extension plan is associated with the work element. So I could look up the element instructions by starting from the work entity page and scrolling down to the bottom, looking up extension plan. And then I would read through the instructions here. In my application profile, I am instructed to record this element using structured description. So under recording a structured description, I can see this option here, record an appropriate term from the RDA extension plan vocabulary encoding scheme. So in essence, this is the controlled vocabulary that I can choose from. So I will choose the term static plan because it best describes what I have with my resource. So here is static plan recorded. I can do the same with the next element, mode of issuance. Because mode of issuance is associated with manifestation, I could navigate to the manifestation entities page and look for the mode of issuance element. However, I can also use the general search box located at the top right side of RDA Toolkit. So if I type in the name of the element, mode of issuance, and search, I can filter my search results by elements only. And here is the element page link for mode of issuance. Now that I am on the element page, I should read the definition and scope, check the breadcrumb trail at the top just to make sure I am still thinking about the correct entity. Here is my element reference card. It tells me, yes, this element is associated with the manifestation entity. I can also check to see if there are specific Mark 21 tags that can be mapped to this element. And I can see that there are some. Here are the recording related instructions. So going back to my application profile, I can see that for mode of issuance, I need to follow the structured description recording method. So structured description. Here in the first option, it tells me to record a term from the controlled vocabulary or the vocabulary encoding scheme for this element. So I have a choice of two terms, either multiple unit or single unit. Because this book is only issued as a single monograph, I can say that single unit is the most appropriate term. I then methodically work through the rest of the elements that are listed in my application profile. So for example, title proper, I can look up title proper in the RDA Toolkit. Here is the element for title proper. Again, read through definition and scope. It tells me title proper is a nomen, that is the title of manifestation. Select a preference in a specific application or context. An alternative title is treated as part of a title proper. So here is the confirmation of the domain of this element. And I can see the associated Mark 21 subfield. And I read through these instructions around pre-recording, and my application profile tells me to follow the LCPCC policy statement if it is available. So I can see that there is a policy statement here. And if I scroll down, here are the instructions for recording my unstructured description for the title proper. It might tell you that you basically record your title proper according to instructions around title of manifestation. So if you wanted to click on that, here's more instructions specifically about title of manifestation. And then you would look for the condition and option that applies. So looking at my resource, there is only one clear title proper, and that is Scarborough. You might have noted that on the front cover, there were the words a novel, and I have made the decision to record that as a note on manifestation. So you can look up what note on manifestation means in the RDA toolkit as well. So after I follow through each of these elements and record the values based on what I saw in my analysis of the resource, you might be able to fill out all of these values here. And these are the element by element values. And you might be thinking, well, I'm cataloging within a MARC environment. So how do I transform my element values into MARC data? Remember that RDA is a content standard. RDA does not dictate which encoding scheme to use. So any library that catalogs according to RDA can implement their data according to any of the 4 implementation scenarios I described before we launched into our demo. Here on the slide in front of you is an example of how I might encode my data element values within a MARC bibliographic record. MARC tags and subfield codes are color-coded in orange. As you explore the RDA toolkit more, you will notice that certain element reference cards within the RDA toolkit also provide you with MARC tag mappings, as shown here. You can also search for specific MARC tags by using the search box up here. So thank you so much for your attention. If you want to learn more about RDA, I highly recommend exploring Chris Oliver's book, Introducing RDA, A Guide to the Basics After 3R. I also recommend taking a look at the RDA Toolkit YouTube channel, specifically the RDA Concepts playlist and the webinars RDA Application Profiles and Entity Boundaries. Please also stick around for Thomas's session on aggregates and diachronic works in RDA. I welcome your questions and comments.